Sancta Maria Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
This is Timothy Flanders, the meaning of Catholic. Welcome to Our Lady of Victory, the Monday morning man show with co-host Jake Fowler and Nicholas Cavazos, and special returning guest, Dr. Larry Chapp. Dr. Chapp, good to have you on the show today.
Good to be here, bright and early in the morning.
Yes, Dr. Chapp has milked his cows and fed the chickens. And after all that, after he already got up at 3 a.m., he's joined us today after farmer's hours, late in the morning, 6 a.m. Eastern time, 5 a.m. Central.
Yeah, I'm ready for a nap already. So.
Yeah, if you don't know Dr. Larry Chapp, I've been wanting to get more contributors to Meaning of Catholic from the communio side of things. And Dr. Larry Chapp is a scholar of Hans Urs von Balthasar. He is a consulting editor of the English edition of the Communio Theological Journal, and he writes at gaudiumetspes22.com. So, Dr. Chapp, what's going on? What's new with you? Any new projects, new books? What's going on with you?
Well, I'm currently working on a book for Word on Fire on the universal call to holiness. And of course, this past year, my book called Confession of a Catholic Worker came out from Ignatius Press, which is doing very well, I guess. I mean, people seem to enjoy it. And of course, I spent most of this past 6 months touring around, really, really busy traveling, giving. This was the year of speaking engagements. This is the year of lectures and so on. And I spent a lot of time in Rome this year, too, covering the Synod. It started in January. I covered the funeral of Pope Benedict, and then I was covering the Synod and doing a lot of writing for Catholic World Report, National Catholic Register on a lot of intra-ecclesial issues. So that's what's new with me, trying to keep up with things here on the farm. And I'm currently working on a blog post dealing with the signs of the times and get maybe that done today. So that's what's going on with me.
Excellent. Well, that
different kind of signs of the times.
Right? One of the topics I wanted to address was the that motu proprio of Pope Francis, which discusses. Right. I was talking to one theologian who said that it was kind of making the signs of the times into a locus theologicus. So we'll get into that. But before we do, as always, I want to welcome everybody to the last week after Pentecost, aka the last week Tempus per annum. Scandalously translated wrongly as the ordinary time, but it should be called time throughout the year. The last Sunday of Pentecost and the Christ the King, if you're on the new calendar as well, both really talking about the second coming. And I love what Michaela Harrison has done with this beautiful piece of art, which is always reclaiming the rainbow. This is from the book of Revelation when there's the vision of Christ enthroned, and he's enthroned with a rainbow. It's awesome. So reclaim the rainbow. And we also have the beginning of the St. Andrew Novena, the Feast of St. Andrew, and St. Bibiana this week, before the first Sunday after, first Sunday of Advent. I just checked and realized today that we have the shortest Advent possible coming up because Christmas is on a Monday, and so Advent is actually the shortest possible. So it's a 3 week straight Advent. So it's interesting. So excited for that. It's a great time of year. Hope everybody in the United States had a happy Thanksgiving. Lots to be thankful for. It's a great time to be Catholic. Wanted to remind everybody to join. You can join the let's see, where is this? Okay, Mary Queen of the Home Academy, meaningofcatholic.com/academy. We have our Latin study group. Our current courses for adults are the Catholic Political Thought with Gideon Lazarus is still going on. And then we have our Latin study group with me every Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. You can sign up for this every month for $100 or for guild members, $75 a month. So we just study Latin every week. If you want to brush up on your Latin, this is for Latin beginners, Latin 101. If you want to join the guild, help our mission of uniting Catholics against the enemies of Holy Church, it's at meaningofcatholic.com/register. So let's talk about what's the latest. Now, Larry, Dr. Chapp, you spent time in Rome. Didn't you have 2 trips to Rome? Tell us about your time in Rome. What did you see?
Well, yeah, first I was at the funeral of Pope Benedict, and I have to say that what I saw there was an indication that I suspected things were going to start accelerating and not in a good way, because I really thought that the manner in which the Vatican handled the funeral of Pope Benedict was kind of shameful. I don't want to go into all the details, but it's just his funeral was not treated with the respect and dignity that he deserved for his entire career, not just as Pope. And as you know, as a former Pope, I thought he deserved a much better send-off than what he got. And let's just leave it at that. So, but I just remember thinking, okay, now that the Pope Emeritus is deceased, is Pope Francis going to feel a little unfettered now to sort of put his program more in place without any worry about needing to do rearguard actions with the sort of supporters of Pope Benedict? Not that Pope Benedict necessarily supported, the criticisms of Pope Francis, whether quietly or not. The fact is, I'm sure Pope Francis was aware that Pope Benedict had coalesced around him this, loyal opposition to Francis. So I thought maybe with the demise of Pope Benedict, the gloves would come off and I think they have. I think that then I came back to Rome in October for the Synod on Synodality, and it's just the whole atmosphere in Rome had changed. And now there was this sense of expectation in the air that now we can finally get things done. Now, after 60 years of interruption of previous meddlesome popes who didn't understand Vatican II, we can finally get around to implementing the business of Vatican II, which apparently is the uber democratization and Protestantization and secularization of the church. Apparently that's what Vatican II wanted. And we're now here under Pope Francis to implement. I'm not saying Pope Francis believes that. I don't think he does, but that's in a caricature, but nevertheless, I think an accurate one of those who the Pope has put in charge of the Synod on Synod. People like Cardinal Hollerich of Luxembourg, who is on record saying that the church's teaching on homosexuality is simply not in need of nuance or tweaking, but wrong. It just needs to be changed wholesale. And you get this from Cardinal McElroy in San Diego as well. The fact that James Martin was made, and Father James Martin, a voting member of the Synod. The fact that the Pope granted a private audience to Sister Janine Gramick of New Ways Ministry. All of that is indicative of an entirely different atmosphere in Rome that you saw at the Synod. And I talked to some people who were Synod participants. I don't want to say who, for reasons of confidentiality. But, they sort of confirmed that our point of view, the point of view represented, say, by JP2 Catholics, that point of view was in the minority at the Synod, that the majority voice was the progressive voice of, hey, yeah, let's change everything.
And
wouldn't you say that's...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Tim. Go ahead.
I'll just ask one more question, then give it over to you, Jake, if you want to ask. So, and one thing that ended the Synod was this motu proprio about a paradigm shift in theology. What are your comments on that as a theologian? And also, I was curious because you finished your PhD in what year, Dr. Chapp?
1994.
1994. So, but you're going through formation here, 80s and into the 90s.
Oh yeah.
How do you see this motu proprio about theological formation from the Pope that happened at the end of the Synod?
Well, I think first off, it's one of the dumbest papal documents I've ever read in my entire life. Short, sparse on details, long on caricature, straw men, generalities that point us in some troubling directions. I thought it was an altogether inadequate document. And it is no accident that it came just like within a week after the Synod was over. And the Synod is talking about we need to be a listening church, a synodal church, a church that is enculturated, a church that takes the signs of the time seriously, finally, and all this. And then this shows up in the motu proprio. Most pundits don't think the Pope wrote it. Most people think that Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the DDF, wrote it. I agree with that. I think he did. It came out with papal approval, so it's a papal document, but it reads like Tucho Fernandez wrote it. And there are two main complaints. Number one, that first, I'll back up a second. On the surface, it appears anodyne. On the surface, it appears, well, what's wrong with this? An average reader reading this without sort of understanding the history of Catholic theology over the past 60 to 100 years is just going to think, well, sure, because the document says that the theology needs to be rooted in wisdom and prayer and adoration. Good. The document says that theology needs to take into consideration modern culture, the subjective experience of human beings, the cultural revolution in which we live. Yeah, fine, good. But then when you dig deeper, there's problems. First off, there's an implication when it says we can no longer do theology in this deductive, abstract way where we just repeat the stale formulas of the past. What I would like to know is what modern theologians are doing that. In other words, there is a straw man caricature going on of what the Theological Guild and the Theological Project is. Nobody is doing theology today in abstract and deductive ways. We're just repeating the stale formulas of the past. That's just an absolute, not just a straw man and a caricature. It's a vile insult against what's been going on. I mean, the fact of the matter is the 20th and early 21st century has seen the greatest explosion of creative Catholic theology in the history of the church since the medieval era. For better or for worse, some of it's great, some of it isn't so great. All right, but the idea that we're still locked in this sort of neo-scholastic paradigm of deduction and abstraction and repeating the anathemas of Trent or whatever it is that this document is implying that we're doing is absolutely absurd. So what? And the people that wrote this document, whoever it was, had to know that they were engaging in a straw man caricature. So why the caricature? Why the falsehood? Because theology is already taking into account the signs of the times, the culture of today, subjective experience of individuals. So why this? Because it serves a rhetorical purpose. They needed a foil against which to push. And what they want to propose instead comes through then when they start talking about contextualized theology, theologies of experience, theology that takes culture into consideration and so on. Well, okay, there's a pedigree to those words. Those words mean something in the history of Catholic theology. They're buzzwords, they're dog whistles, and they're hearkening back to a form of theology that began in Protestantism in the 19th century, caught on in the modernist sort of theologians in the 20th century, but then really caught on fire after the council in the 60s, 70s, and 80s amongst theologians who wanted to say, and you said it earlier, Timothy, that they wanted to make subjective experience a locus of revelation, a locus of theology. Now, there's a certain sense in which that's true, but in other words, they wanted to have the experiential tail wagging the revelational dog. Instead of beginning with the truths of revelation and then mining those truths for insights and how to interpret our experience as human beings in modern culture, they want to begin with experience and culture and then work their ways up towards a wholesale reconstruction of what it is that revelation is saying. You see this then in the final document that came out from the Synod, where it talks about the need for our sexual ethics to catch up with modern anthropology. And Bishop Robert Barron recently had his commentary on the Synod, where he hit very much against this document that came out from the Synod on that point. And it's part and parcel of the same point as this motu proprio is making. We need a different theological anthropology grounded in modern experiences. And then we need to reinterpret Revelation in the light of those experiences. How extensively Revelation gets interpreted then is going to be the real key here. And whether or not, Pope Francis is going to allow this or not, I don't know. Anyway, that in a nutshell is my take on things.
That's very interesting. And I'm nodding my head most of the time because these are themes that have come up on your show, right? And themes that we seem to be encountering again and again in what I would loosely characterize as conservative Catholic news media, places like the Register and the Catholic World Report and things like that. With all that in mind, actually, just as an aside, I've engaged in the last decade plus, in my theological studies, which aren't that extensive, but substantial. I've engaged with Ratzinger and JP2 and De Lubac and Guardini and von Balthasar to what I think is a significant enough degree to kind of have a handle on what these guys were all about. And on the one hand, you could say that they're very much entrenched, whatever baggage that word brings with it. They're very rigid in the sense that they're 100% committed to Christ and the church. But on the other hand, you could also say these are the very people reading the signs of the times and putting forth a reaction. And that now seems to be being rejected. Right. So with that in mind, and then with what you said before, Larry, about the participants, you kind of named some of them. Why should any of us care that this thing is even happening? It's clear that it does not represent the general trend in theology, or hasn't yet. It's clear that it doesn't represent actual Catholic opinion. It's just maybe some old liberals running their mouth in Rome. Like, why do I care? Why does any of us care?
Yeah, well, from one perspective, we shouldn't care, and this is counsel. I mean, there are a lot of Catholics out there right now, and I'm kind of writing a blog piece on this, who are very troubled in their faith by all of this. What does it all mean? Does it mean I can't trust the Pope anymore, and so on and so forth? I say, nah. You know, the church has had sketchy popes before, and I don't think this pope's a heretic. I think he's not a good pope, but I don't think he's a heretic. Others might disagree with me on that. And so I really think the Holy Spirit is going to preserve and protect the Catholic Church from falling into heresy. I just don't think that's going to happen. And therefore there's a sense in which I say to average Catholics, well, don't worry about it. It is just a bunch of old liberals in Rome, the last gasp of the kind of progressive theology of the 70s having its day under this Pope. And this too shall pass. This too shall pass. On the other hand, it is important. And for those Catholics who perhaps are educated Catholics and are involved in some kind of ministry, whether it's lay ministry or clerical ministry, whether they're teachers of the faith or like you guys running a podcast like this, then it is important. Because souls are at stake. And it's not just a question of ecclesial politics. It's a question of converting souls to Christ. It's a question of saving souls for Christ. And you know, I hate to sound pietistical and cliche in that regard, but when you have this sort of message emanating from Rome that, being gay is no big deal, and we're not going to really make a stink about it. These are so-called pelvic issues. We've been obsessed with this in the past. Now we're not going to be obsessed. So let's just adopt a more latitudinarian, live and let live sort of mentality. And yeah, priests can even bless gay people that show up, so long as we're aware that we're not blessing the union, and so on. Of course, that's silly. Of course, they're blessing the union. Everybody and their blind pet hamster knows that that's what's going to happen. So yeah, I think we're right to be disturbed by that, because that is green lighting sin, and it's never good for the church to green light sin, especially mortal sins, especially sins. And I say mortal sin not in some old catechism sense, but I mean mortal. These are sins that potentially have the effect of destroying your relationship with God, rupturing your relationship with God in profound and toxic ways. And we simply cannot have the church greenlighting that sort of toxicity. It goes back to I love, there's a French historian, Alain Besançon, who's written some wonderful books called On the Falsification of the Good, as he calls it. And this to me is terribly important, that we push back against this, because we're seeing a reversal of values take place here. As I think it was Richard Newhouse once, what is first called evil is then tolerated, and then once it's tolerated, it's kind of then becomes more mainstream, and then once it's mainstream, it becomes prescribed, and then opposition to it becomes the hateful thing. So you see this grand reversal of values, and this is my fear in the church, that you're going to end up with a de facto approval of all of these things, that you're going to see this falsification of the good. And I think that's very important for Catholics to push back against.
Flanders, any additional comments? I was interested in getting Nicholas's thoughts on this, honestly, because as the proverbial young gun of the bunch, you're sort of, one could say, more plugged in with the younger generation, right? If we need to draw a hard line somewhere, I would say the line is somewhere between Tim and I's age and Nicholas's age, right? Where that, I'm still of what I think is a different breed than some of the guys now. So not to cast aspersions, but Nick, what's your perception of the general youth in the church and how they look at the synod, and what does it mean for them, and all that stuff? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I think for the youth that is actually practicing the faith and is not taking it kind of just as a thing that their parents are dragging them to on a Sunday morning, for those who are actually practicing the faith, I think the vast majority think it's a joke. I think it's a complete joke, and I think it's very interesting because on the one hand, you have the crowd that thinks it's a joke and kind of like me wants to fight it. We kind of see this in a certain sense as kind of the establishment, if you will, like almost in a political sense, like an establishmentarian style system that is just not doing its job and needs to be kind of overhauled. A lot of young people are kind of using the language of holding our leaders accountable. And so what they mean by that is things along the nature of how do we hold the Pope, how do we hold the local bishops accountable for teaching the Catholic faith? Like, what do we need to do? Because we don't see a lot of older generations actually speaking out against that. We actually see, it seems, older generations trying to reinterpret everything to feel better. That's just how we perceive it. Whether or not that's true or not, that's just at least the perception. And then I'd say the second and final group of young people, I think, get so scandalized that they find great depression. And I think where this emanates from is that they see an ever-changing world on social media every single day, from the world of dating to the world of school to the world of politics. They see the craziness in personal families, the craziness in societal government, and they want to look to the church as a bedrock to hold on to some just basic sanity. But when especially young men look toward the church at the moment, what did we get from especially the synodal surveys? Oh, well, we need to have a more inclusive church for women. Women are involved in every single thing at this point. There is no massive ministry for young men at all. There isn't. You can say the priesthood, of course, right? And that's true. But I'm just talking about, like, what is an active way that your local parish is going to engage young single men who are, confused, who feel like society has pushed them away, and things along that nature. Like, where is that? There was no discussion about single young men at all. And so therefore, I think a lot of those individuals, unfortunately, I've seen quite a few young men leave the faith entirely, either for the common, of course, is Eastern Orthodoxy, but I've seen a handful of them also leave for even things like Islam. Now, I'm not justifying that because I believe that the Catholic faith is divinely revealed by God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. And so therefore, I disagree with their conclusions. But on an emotional level, on a psychological level, I understand where they're coming from. They want to find a father who actually gives them some answers, and they're not just confused all day. And then I guess the final thing I'd say, at least in regarding to this point, is that when it comes to, I was glad, Dr. Chapp, that you mentioned evangelization, because I have a huge heart for evangelization, and it's become exponentially hard to try to evangelize either youths in the context of catechism, right? So, I teach 6th and 7th grade youths, and a lot of times they're being bombarded from the nonsense that you find at the local secular public school. And then their parents are like, well, what do you mean that homosexuality is a sin? Like, doesn't Pope Francis teach that it's okay? And this is just the common parish level experience where they're saying these types of things. Or you see people, for instance, like my mom and my dad, who are not Catholic, right? But I'm slowly working on them, if you will, over time, to where they're starting to engage in actions of the faith, such as going to mass with me, going to adoration with me for the first time. My mom did about 2 weeks ago, right? Great stuff. But their biggest thing, and I know that this is not unique to my parents, is Pope Francis. That's their big stumbling block, which is somewhat interesting because you think in the context of the past, it would be papal infallibility, the Marian teachings for your average Protestant, et cetera, et cetera. Nope. They can study all that stuff. But to be at least very brutally honest, they say, I just don't know if I can submit to a communist. That's their words, not mine. And so that's just at least how the youth see it, and then the practical ramifications in evangelization.
Gotcha. Thank you for that perspective. I would say, on the one hand, I understand and I can empathize with your parents' perspective on Pope Francis. On the other hand, I wonder, maybe that's what was at the root of my question before. So maybe I phrased it poorly. I shouldn't have said, why should we care, and sort of dismiss it all, because you guys all, Larry and Nicholas, you guys gave very good reasons why we should care. But maybe what I should have said was something more like, given what we know about the church and what we know from Revelation, we should do our best to at least attempt to not let this trouble us. Right. So not why should I care? There's no issue here, but okay, I'm going to recognize that there is a problem. I'll do what I can in my sphere of life to address it. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to lose sleep over it, because the church is indefectible. Maybe that's kind of the way I should have phrased it. And if that were the more common perspective, then maybe we wouldn't see people leaving the faith, running around with their hair on fire, talking about, calling the Pope a heretic, or whatever else is happening these days. So Tim and Nicholas may disagree to a certain extent, but Larry and I know for a fact, are convinced that the way forward through this mess is to reignite, if you will, the project of the Communio scholars, and go ahead and engage the modern world, but bring to it a robust understanding of the faith, of the deposit that we have received and how it's grown and developed through the years, and tackle these new questions with fresh energy. I don't know a better way to describe it, Larry. What do you say on this?
Well, I think that's true. I think it's important to point out, though, that we're not talking here about communal theologians being, in a sense, the new Thomas Aquinas or something. What I would rather say is that the project that they initiated, which is using Aquinas but reading him through the lens of the fathers, a reignited emphasis on Scripture, and so on. So, in other words, not reducing Catholic theology to simply Thomistic studies. And I think that's important, because originally in the Ray Sorsmont school of thought in the middle of the 20th century, I think there was a throw the baby out with the bathwater too much mentality. We had this oppressive Thomism, so let's just kick off the Thomists and go forward with the fathers and Scripture. But I think now the pendulum is swinging, and even the Communio theologians realize, well, no, we're about retrieving the entirety of the tradition, and that includes Aquinas. So we need, in a sense, I think, going forward, this grand collaborative effort on the part of Communio theologians of all kinds, of Thomistic scholars of all kinds, Augustinian scholars of all kinds, as we try to reignite the church's theology around her deepest and most profound traditions. And I really think that is the way. And I think the progressive theology is a dead end. And I'll just say this too. I want to add one thing. I said earlier that the Pope is not a heretic. And what I want to nuance that a bit and say he might hold private theological opinions that contain material heresy. I think he probably does. My point is simply that I don't think he is formally taught on a magisterial level something that you can point to and say that's clearly a heretical doctrine. Because I think you can spin almost everything he's taught magisterially in an orthodox way. You can spin it that way if you want to. The closest thing to teaching something that's heretical, I think, that he's come is the Abu Dhabi statement, where he said God wills the pluralism of all religions. And I haven't kept up with whether he backtracked from that and, whatever. But then again, also, of what magisterial weight is that document and so forth. But the bottom line is this. I don't think people should lose sleep over, oh my God, the papacy has been proven false because the Pope's a heretic. I don't think that's a concern.
Yeah, well, I like what you're saying, Dr. Chapp. That's certainly that's the mission of Meaning of Catholics, is to broaden that collaborative effort, to promote the collaborative effort between these different schools of thought. And I totally agree with your assessment of the history, that there was this sort of 1960s fervor, even with the good guys, or at least they were allowing for the bad guys to sort of take over too much because of this 1940s and 50s situation, where there was at least a perceived oppressive atmosphere that resulted in this animosity. And so we would definitely promote that same thing. Another aspect of this I see is there's a breakdown in the generations. So there's a generations we call, in the United States, there's different names for these different generations. There's the GI generation, the silent generation, the boomer generation, Generation X, and all this. And I think that the reason this indicates they're labeling these different generations because the generations are isolated from one another, which is a cultural abnormality. You should not have generations isolated from one another. Part of this is these marketing companies are trying to do that so they can isolate people into demographics and market their products and whatnot. But it also is happening, I think, in the church, where you go to an average parish and you have a particular generation mostly in that parish, and the younger generation, like I'm like a millennial, whatever you want to call it, may not connect with what's going on. But I think we can also, the younger generation we can also have sort of what I would call a modernist view of this, where we don't actually want to reconnect with that generation that kind of isolated itself. We want to also disdain that generation as well, which would be also an error on the other side. So, Dr. Chapp, can you talk any comments on the generational isolation that we've experienced?
Yeah, I think one of the unfortunate side effects of that, and I think that's true, and I think a lot of it is marketing driven, as you pointed out, is one of the unfortunate things is that a lot of younger Catholics today look at the current situation and they simply say, well, if this is the fruit of 20th century Catholic theology and Vatican II, then I want no part of it. And so then there's this sort of scorched earth rejection of the council, and not just then progressive theologians, but even theologians, like a Guardini, De Lubac, Ratzinger, and then they even get suspicious of popes like John Paul and Benedict and so on. And I think that's unfortunate. And then there's, of course, the tendencies. We just need to go back to Garrigou-Lagrange and the Neo-Scholastics and the anathemas of Trent, and all will be well. And then that's understandable. I can understand the psychology and the sociology, but we have to work to overcome that because it is a form of nostalgia and romanticism that is rooted in a false understanding of how healthy the church was before the council. Because if the church before the council was so darn healthy, why did it collapse almost overnight right after the council? Was there some magic switch that just got turned on where all of a sudden now we're all going to fall into this insanity? No, the rot was already there. Ratzinger noted already in 1958 in his bombshell article, The New Heathenism in the Church, all right, that the church was rotting from within. And we saw all kinds of scholars in the 20th century warning us that the church was rotting from within. And by the way, vocations were already starting to take a downward turn in the 1950s already. They were all obviously stronger than what came after, but still a downward. So I think we need to do a better job of communicating a full-orbed understanding of the modern history of the church, why the council was necessary, even if it had deep flaws, and it did. And therefore, what we need to do to move forward. I want to add this too. We need to the one thing about the current generation that I think that they get right, that they understand, that they instinctively know, is that there's something profoundly wrong with modern culture and something profoundly wrong with the church that apes that culture. And one of my chief problems with the Synod on Synodality, the recent motu proprio, and this papacy in general, is that it seems to want us to follow modern culture. I mean, look at the Germans are saying we need to okay the ordination of women. We need to okay LGBTQ, this, that, and the other thing, in order for the church not to die here in Germany. Well, newsflash, the Protestants have already done that in Germany, and they're in worse condition than the Catholics. We act as if there's no control in this grand experiment of progressive watering down of the faith. There is. It's called liberal Protestantism, and it's been going on for over 100 years, and it's been proven a pastoral catastrophe. And wherever it shows up in Catholicism, in various very, very, very liberal dioceses, it proves itself to be a pastoral catastrophe. And this is at least what I think this current generation understands understands well, that this move towards an inclusive, everyone, tutti church is actually a recipe for complete pastoral irrelevance. The church is going to shrink in the face of modern Western culture, whether we accommodate ourselves to that culture or not. And it will actually paradoxically shrink more the more it accommodates itself to that culture, because it will be shown to be a complete irrelevance.
And one more question for me, and I want to kick it back to follower Cavazos for final comments or questions. You mentioned that we need to overcome all that, referring to sort of a nostalgic look at the neo-scholastic period, Garrigou-Lagrange, post-Vatican I. Can you clarify, maybe in referring to this concept of the signs of the times, that you're writing an article about that right now? What do you mean exactly by overcoming a nostalgic view, but also, as you said before, not trying to throw out that in a revolutionary fervor sense? So how do we properly read the signs of the times, and how can that be distinguished from a neo-modernist reading of the signs of the times?
Well, that's a complicated question, but let's start with the fact that there was a great deal of good in the neo-scholastic theology, like you said, post-Vatican I, after Leo XIII's, Aeterne Patris, recommending Thomas Aquinas, and there was a Thomistic revival and all kinds of different schools of Thomism. These were all good things. And when I say we need to recover, I think we need to recover the clarity, the definitional clarity that the scholastics had. Communio ressourcement theology trends in a more poetic, lyrical, sapiential direction. And that's its beauty, that's its strength. But there, as even von Balthasar noted, the great advance of the Thomistic school is this definitional clarity. And so when I say we need to retrieve some of that, I think it's important for us to retrieve a lot of that definitional clarity that the scholastics brought. What needs to be overcome, however, is this idea that because the church had doctrinal and theological definitional clarity back in the day, say between Vatican I and Vatican II, because it had this unbending edifice of truth that everything was okay. Well, things were not okay, because even though on a doctrinal level the church had not succumbed in any way, shape, or form to modernity and fought modernity, for the most part, the average lay Catholic in the church had a very legalistic, the theological, the very forensic understanding of the faith. It was a very contractual form of Catholicism. I fulfill the following duties, and then I get salvational cookies, XYZ. And as long as I'm jumping through these ecclesial hoops, then I'm okay. It was very much, I hate to caricature, but very much a religion of living by a certain set of rules and a view of the church as a rule maker. And that's why kind of after Vatican II, whether it was true or not, the media portrayed the council as saying there aren't any rules anymore. Catholics just get to do whatever they want now. And as soon as that's why it fell apart so quickly, because when you live a religion based on rules, and then all of a sudden they say, well, your religion no longer has any rules, then it's like little kids getting out of school, on a field trip or something. They go nuts. And we went crazy. As I like to say, they lifted the lid off the ecclesiastical libido, and everybody went crazy. And I lived through that craziness, and I saw it. And so this is the kind of nostalgia that I'm talking about. This looking back at the definitional clarity that the church had at that time, and the liturgical clarity that it had at that time, and saying, what a golden era. And yet all of that clarity was masking over underneath a kind of deep rot of the faith, where the average Catholic really was a secular, modern, bourgeois person with just sort of a Catholic veneer, Catholic sprinkles on the secular ice cream. And there was something not good going on in the church. And many neo-scholastics, even Garrigou-Lagrange were taking note of this, that there's something wrong in the church.
Well, there you have it.
Followers, you guys got any comments or questions?
Nicholas?
Yeah, the residential Thomist, I guess. I guess final thoughts for me. Yeah, I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Chapp. I'd say I can understand where the perception is when it comes to nostalgia, because there's a lot of my generation, just in general, is an extremely nostalgic generation. When you go on social media trends, you see so many people, they're dressing like they're in the 1940s, 1950s. And I think that that's a cool thing, because they're actually wearing clothes for once online. So it's nice. And so, yeah, my generation, we have no culture. We have nothing that's being passed down to us, essentially, sound from hand-me-downs from parents or something. And so we're just dying for something. But I do think that what will be interesting to see will be individuals like me who receive, who grow up in the world of non-denominational Protestantism, right, which is very much so affected by the secular culture, even though doctrinally it's actually a little bit more I guess, conservative than some of the craziness that we see going on here, at least in its morals. But a non-denominational kid walking into a Catholic cathedral, going to his first Tridentine Mass and being absolutely just amazed, but then that kicking off my journey into my undergrad and now my graduate degree, which is heavily influenced on the big scary preconciliar neo-scholastic manuals and things along that nature, but finding within that a practical application, which has been nothing more than a fervor or a gas thrown onto my relationship with God, which is something that's just like it's been great. But I do think you're right. I think what will be the bridge, perhaps in the future, between the two parties, for lack of better terms, will be a mutual understanding between both, in which both recognize the fruits and that each other bring to the table, as well as the excesses, whether that be the throwing out of Thomism or just pure reductions down to things that just mask over a hidden depravity, right? A hidden depravity and a lack of ascetical and mystical life in the soul. It'll be very interesting because maybe while the generations in the past took these great theological textbooks and used them in that type of way, it'll be interesting to see a younger generation who is not in that context, who's surrounded by the craziness of modernity, taking these things and using them, perhaps in the way that they were intended in the future. We can only hope so. I guess we'll see what happens in the future.
I know you guys want to wrap up. I want to say some really quick, and it's about liturgy. You mentioned the beauty of the Tridentine liturgy, and it is beautiful. But I just want to remind people, too, that before the council, when that liturgy was the standard liturgy of the church, it was quite often done very poorly. And it is unfair to compare the grand Tridentine liturgies that are done today in these wonderful settings with the average parish Latin Mass that was done, say, in the 1930s through the 50s or whatever. It wasn't unusual at all for a Sunday Mass to last 25 minutes with no choir, no chant, the priest stumbling and mumbling his way through Latin. And so we need to remember that if we're going to retrieve the liturgy, let's really retrieve it and make sure that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, it's a good critique, because as I always tell people, we can critique the new Mass for all of the craziness that we might see on an internet video. But yet there was shallow performance of the Tridentine Mass in the preconciliar era. That's why, at least on my show, I just say the best thing to do is do an objective view side by side of what the missals say themselves.
Yes. I think the old Mass is an objectively superior liturgy to the new Mass. But anyway.
Well, I think, one thing that maybe just occurred to me, maybe I'm slow to realize this, but something that can span both of those groups, if you will, those who prefer a more neo-scholastic iteration of Catholicism and those who prefer like a more ressourcement, and the generations, like you were mentioning before, Tim, between pre and post Vatican II, it seems like what we find is that both groups are at risk of a worldview that sees the church as irrelevant. Maybe, Larry, that's why people were so bored back in their parish in 1935, and maybe in 1999 or today, even, when people are like, well, that's nice if you can believe that if you want, but what does it really matter? Because the church in a certain way has not responded to a large sign of the times, which is to say that a lot of folks just think that, well, that's fine if that's what you want, but it's ultimately irrelevant, and I don't need this in order to live a happy and fulfilled life. Whether or not you believe in some kind of God or religion is all well and good, but just again, leave me alone. And I think this is a manifestation of the absolute the degree to which the liberal Enlightenment sort of thinking has permeated almost everything these days, where it's all just a matter of personal preference. And I just need to find something that matters in my own life. And if it's Catholicism, that's great. And if it's not, that's great. Don't judge me. Right. So there's this dynamic, it seems, of irrelevance, right? Irrelevance in the 40s when you have the Garrigou Lagranges writing very, very precise and beautiful. I have a few of them myself. They're beautiful books. But if the person in the 40s doesn't care, then Garrigou Lagrange is off the mark. And then you've got, the guys in the 60s and 70s. And some of that stuff is great. And I have those books and I love it. But if the people reading them don't care, and the same for today, you could read Matthew Levering, and he's a wonderful synthesis of Thomism and ressourcement.
Yes, he is.
But if you don't care what Levering has to say, so I guess what I'm saying is, one of the things that we've missed, and I think that the Synod misses, and a large chunk of the church needs, is relevance. Not relevance like what we were, you said before about aping the church and trying to just sort of mimic modernity. That's not relevance, but relevance in a way that matters at the deepest core of who we are as human beings, created in the image of God. So I guess my final thought is, again, don't be troubled by the Synod. Yes, there are issues. We'll get through it, but find a way in your own life to realize the relevance of Christ and his holy church, and then live that. And that's what we need to do. That's what we do here, and we try to.
I agree.
Anyways.
Yeah, that's a great final piece to end our final week of time after Pentecost, and to begin this final week applying this in our own life. And I think of when Dr. Chapp talked about the rot before Vatican II. I want to speak especially to trads who might be alarmed by that comment. We can think about Fatima and how Fatima came in 1917 and talked about all this sin that was going on. And we like to think that it was just like non-Catholic sinning, but World War I happened between a bunch of baptized Catholics killing each other. And Fatima was coming to come against the Catholics in first to talk about the wrath of God being poured out on the Catholic Church itself. And this was way back in 1917. So we're talking about a rot, the problems that were going on in the church, that God was even pouring out his wrath upon these problems in the church long before Vatican II. So we have a problem here. So with all that as well, we can think about the triumph of the Immaculate Heart and how we're going to ultimately win out because Jesus is King. So let's offer up a Hail Mary and invoke our lay patrons here. Also, stay tuned for Larry Chapp. Dr. Chapp has given me permission to post some of his channel content here at Meaning of Catholic as well to contribute to this conversation. Yes. So stay tuned for that. And then you can go to GaudiumSpes22.com for Dr. Chapp's writings, as well as the coming article on the signs of the time. So let's pray. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Our Lady of Victory,
pray for us.
Mary, Queen of the Home,
pray for us.
Saint Joseph, Terror of Demons,
pray for us.
Saint Anthony of the Desert, pray for all clergy and seminarians. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Jesus is King.